Hello, everyone. My name is Gil Penalosa, and this is Cities for Everyone, the webinar, where every other week I invite fascinating people to share their knowledge and experience so that all of us can become better advocates on creating cities that are equitable, sustainable, playful. Originally from Bogota, Colombia, and now I live in Toronto, Canada, where 20 years ago I created 880 cities. And this webinar is a way of giving back. I have worked in over 350 cities around the world. So I want to give back, inviting people and making this webinar free. I want to thank Cities for Better Health and 880 Cities for helping me cover the cost of this webinar so that all of you can come and join us for free. Today we have a fascinating session on lonely cities, how urban systems can both produce and prevent loneliness. And the presentation is by Ann-Britt Elvin Andersen, who's going to tell us how to deal with this epidemic, especially at the city level, at the structure, the policies, the infra, the programs. Welcome, Ann-Britt. Thank you very much for having accepted this invitation.
Thank you. Yes, I'm based. It's so exciting to meet so many people from around the world. You're really quite the gatherer, girl, and that is what we need to prevent loneliness. I'm based in Copenhagen, in Denmark, in Scandinavia. I work in an organization called Blocks Hub. We are a hub for sustainable urbanization. We are non-profit. We are primarily a philanthropy. And to keep this short, a few years ago we started noticing we receive a lot of international delegations. We have 400 members across the world, and we started receiving there was something stirring, and we could see that loneliness was popping up everywhere. Everybody had a personal story to tell. It was a theme that resonated a lot. So we went on. Actually, it started out that we wanted to do a small project with a Japanese partner called Nikin Sekkei, a huge architectural company, that sort of just made itself bigger and bigger and ended up in this publication, The Paradox of Proximity, where Gil is also a contributor. That was the first time I met him about a year ago when I interviewed you. We teamed up with Cities for Better Health, which, of course, you just heard a few words about as well from Gil, to do this publication about how do we, from an urban planning perspective, deal with the global loneliness epidemic. So on that note, I'll share my screen and take you to a small presentation. And afterwards, of course, as Gil said, we'll have a Q&A. I'm also joined by my colleague Jakob, who's also working on this particular topic. So I want to start you off with a small story here. When I did this publication, I went to various parts of the world, but I especially went to Seoul in Korea, and to interview the director from the Seoul Metropolitan Government's Social Isolation Prevention Center. And she had a very moving story to tell, or something that had struck her really when I asked her, what is one of the most defining moments in your career when you do this? And she said, when they started out, this was like a crisis hotline. This is something you call if you're on the verge of depression or suicidal. And she said there was a young man in his early 20s calling in just to share that he had gotten a job. And what struck her, and of course, was that this guy who called in did not need therapy. He was not on the verge of suicide. What he needed was basically a friend. He needed a colleague. He needed a neighbor. He was right in the middle of a city that is densely populated, but he had no one to tell. It says something very symptomatic as well, because he is right in the demographic where we see a rise in loneliness right now, and that is among the young people. You see it in Japan, you see it in Korea, but you also see it in North America and in Europe. So what is happening right now? We found this paradox to be both interesting but also extremely alarming. As Gil also mentioned, the American Surgeon General a few years ago defined loneliness as one of the growing epidemics that we were supposed to watch. And just before the summer last year, the WHO came out with a report that sort of declared this problem a global epidemic. That you have 16% of people globally experience loneliness. That equals to about 1 in 6 people that have a problem with loneliness. And what is, of course, interesting is that it is especially rising in cities. I mean, and that is, of course, a paradox because how can we be so close, in close proximity, but not feel connected to other people? And it says something very fundamental about loneliness because loneliness is rarely about distance. It is about disconnection in proximity. So what we did with this publication was how do we delve into this proximity debate and say how can we as urban planners or as architects and even as health professionals as well, how can we solve this problem together? Because normally you would maybe find loneliness being in sort of the health department, but as the WHO also have defined that the urban, how we design our cities or our neighborhoods or how we live or how we define our home also has a huge impact on how we prevent this epidemic. What we, for instance, have discovered when we did this book is that, of course, you have public health, which has a lot of downstream initiative, meaning that they have a lot of good initiatives that, of course, are responding after loneliness appears. That is, you see it, for instance, in Canada, you see a lot of social prescribing. You see it in the UK as well, I know. I know in Denmark, we are having pilot programs that try to do the same. I mean, we have the very more traditional therapy and clinical support, of course, if it reaches a chronic state and it reaches like social isolation, which is something different than loneliness. And of course, we do community programs and we do these targeted interventions. What is interesting is, of course, the contribution that the urban planning industry can bring. And that is, of course, shaping the conditions before this loneliness emerges. And that could be, for instance, how do we design for everyday encounter spaces where we feel a right to connect? How do we view our housing typologies as a social infrastructure and not just strangers in stacks? And also, how do we view our streets and, for instance, in regards to slow mobility? How do we look each other in the eye? How do we acknowledge and how do we sense the city? And how do we have these human scale cities as well? And now my computer is trying to upload, but let's see if we can make it work. Here we go. When we talk about proximity, which is really at the core of a city and how we move about, we have sort of defined 4 key sort of domains about how we define them. And one of them is of course the very traditional here we go. The very traditional way of looking at proximity. That is our housing, very tangible assets. It's our mobility, and it's also the density of a city. Those are that's something you can reach out and touch almost. Then you have the sort of functional proximity, which of course is the efficiency of a city, something that we have been extremely good at and something that has been given a lot of focus in the last decades. And that is how do we move about? How do we design? How do we access stuff? And how is it easy? The easiness and the efficiency of a city. Then we have the sort of more social proximity where we talk about the programming of public spaces. We talk about creating communities as well, and also about our social health. How are we functioning in regards to others when we're out and about or when we are, lingering on or something. But what we found interesting is what we call the emotional proximity, because that is really where loneliness is placed, because loneliness is basically a feeling, and that also means that it's subjective. When I feel lonely is different from when one of all the hundreds of people joining us today feel lonely. That is not one set of code. That is very, very subjective. And how do we plan for individual feelings? We need to look into how do we still sense the city? Is there differences than before? And is some of the cues and some of the codes and some of the clues, not least, are they to be found in how we sort of talk about the emotional proximity, which has more to do with how do we feel seen? How do we feel safe in space? And that is really that links to our mental health. So if we take out that dimension and only look at the other three that might have been more traditionally within the urban environment, we are missing a very, very big piece of the puzzle. When we did this publication, we went across the world in what we call the global north to interview various people. What we normally do when we work in Blockshop is it's important for us to have different perspectives on the same issues. So, for instance, I went to Canada. I interviewed Gil, but I also interviewed other Canadians who had something to say. They might be architects, they might be practitioners, they might be academics who has the latest research. We also went to, for instance, Korea and Japan, where I also interviewed people who have been lonely themselves and who had gone out on the other side and have made some very nice grassroots initiatives that has really spread across the country to see how is it also possible to do these low barrier initiatives that really has a big impact. And then, of course, I was in my sort of home turf, which is Europe, where we went to Turku in Finland to see how do they see almost from a government level, from welfare level, sort of a sports prevention initiatives that helps around 9,000 young people join in to sort of prevent loneliness by having them be physically active and stuff like that. We've also been, of course, to Denmark to look at how we have different co-housing models, and we've went to France as well to interview an urbanist. And what we found was interesting. What was one interesting thing there was when we went to Asia, and we asked, why do we see this rise in loneliness? They will very often give a very cultural explanation where they would say, well, you have to remember that being in a relationship to other people can be difficult and it can be hard work because you have Confucian principles where you are sort of valued across how you are defined in a group. It's very consensus driven. It's very collective thinking. So very often they will say, oh, it can be so difficult. It can be so hard work to be in just out and about amongst other people in a community. So that is why we also see a rise in loneliness. And then now, for instance, I would go to the other side of the world, to North America, and they would give maybe culturally the complete opposite answer by saying, well, the reason why we see this increase in loneliness is also because you have to be the architect of your own fortune. You have to make sure that you're competitive, that you keep on track, and you are making your own success. So, but these sort of contradictory statements, we still see across the world this loneliness issue, and I'm sure there are many, many more. Of course, cultural differences as well. But one thing we have noticed when we did all the research is that we do see tendencies that there are that there are fractured social structures. Families are sort of not the same as they used to be. They're not as tightly knit before. We see the kind of third spaces that might have been community driven, whether it's a church or whether it's a sports association or something else. They're sort of disappearing as well. So there are some glue, some empathetic glue that is not there anymore. And we also see, of course, these parallel digital lives arising a lot. So there is still a lot that we can do together, we think, and that is why when we sort of now we launched this book and we're moving forward, we're actually trying to scope together sort of a multi-year program for preventing with some very concrete tools and practices about doing this on a global scale. If we sort of just very quickly dive into what this publication entails, what we sort of identified very quickly was that there were like 5 lenses where it could be interesting to look at from this loneliness from an urban planning perspective. And we, of course, sort of identified that we had to look at our everyday encounters. Very, very practical. What happens when I meet somebody on the street? Do I acknowledge them or not? What happens if I do my shopping? Do I go to the self checkout, or am I in contact with anybody? That kind of, it's been going on since the 70s, where you talked about weak ties. But if there are sort of disappearing, what happens if you can live your life from an app today without having these small social encounters? Is that also some of the problems? Of course, we look at our housing and how we belong. What has the meaning of a home has maybe changed a lot as well. Before, it was something that sort of defined and was integrated into our social structure. Now we see it, especially in the city, of course, that it's being way more fragmented. And how have we seen very nice examples in the book about how can we sort of gain back, how can we sort of restore this kind of social infrastructure in our housing. We looked at movement and mental health. We all know that physical health is a big driver in also being mentally clear and mentally and have emotional well-being. So we looked at that as well. And of course, we looked at sort of the community networks that often arises, and we took them both from sort of a policy and grassroots level, but also from down below and upwards, sort of as a social capital as well. So from top down to bottom up, we also have descriptions of what community networks can do. And then, of course, we have some projections on where are we heading and what kind of futures and what kind of cities should we strive to program in the future. And we have a few suggestions to that as well. But just on a more happy note, there is, of course, hope when we talk about loneliness, because what we found out is loneliness is predictable, which also means that it is preventable. One example in the publication we found in Korea as well, we found in Seoul, because they have, from a government level, put in $327 million US dollars, what corresponds to US dollars, in identifying a prevention sort of task force. And they do it very digitally as well. They have 47 data points at where they sort of measure at risks before a crisis strike. And that could be everything from water storage to energy usage. It can be tracks or patterns in online shopping habits. Have you been outside the house? So they have this idea of turning hardware into sort of what they call hardware, which is a very sort of sympathetic way of framing it. But they have made a lot of effort from a governmental level of trying to solve this very specific problem. Normally, if I show this slide, we will sometimes sort of prompt people and ask them, when have you felt lonely yourself? And nobody tends to raise their hand, because it's also extremely stigmatizing being lonely. Nobody wants to join the Lonely Club. So we've saw a lot of programs where developers have said, well, nobody's joining them. It might have something to do with the way it's also framed, because nobody wants to be part of the Lonely Club. What we did in this instance is that we went and interviewed, for instance, Jason Thorne, who is the chief architect in Toronto. Another interesting example is Kate Mulligan from the University of Toronto, who has this whole social prescribing going on, where she was able to reduce loneliness by 47% by sort of transforming infrastructure into communities. But a very, very interesting concept came from Professor Sakakura in Tokyo, who not only has a living lab, where he does what he calls a creative era strategy, meaning that his idea of what we just talked about before, that cities has become extremely efficient. He deliberately will restore inefficiency. He will restore serendipity, and he will sort of disrupt if you walk down a street. He will do these crazy pop-ups where he will just make sure that you stop and linger and sense the city. You also have data coming out of MIT recently that say we walk 50% faster in cityscapes, often with AirPods or something similar in our ears. So we're not sensing the city maybe as we used to do. So this idea of doing a very deliberate disruption is something that we do see people who are sort of rebelling against. Another thing that was very, very symptomatic about the whole idea of loneliness over there is the Japanese term or the Japanese concept of ibasho, which basically means, and I'm sure there are maybe Japanese online that can explain it in a more detailed way than maybe I can do, but it means that it's both a mindset of feeling at ease, of feeling completely seen and not in performance, just being yourself and not in sort of a performatory state of mind. It can also mean a physical place. So, for instance, me and my colleague, we have gone to places in Japan where you would go in, people will join up, have dinner, but there will be no deliberate rules of how to perform. So sometimes we would eat something, people will go over and sit on a trampoline and work on the computer, and then they will go back and chip in. So that idea of non-performance can be extremely validating and preventive when we talk about loneliness and the design of loneliness, because loneliness basically is a feeling that if it becomes chronic, it changes behavior. Another thing, and I know our host, Gil, this is something that is extremely close to his heart, is what we call our programming, the software of belonging, because community happens when you give people a reason to show up. So if you see examples in our book, you will look at, for instance, Gil, who of course he can go into details even more in our dialogue afterwards about how intergenerational design can be a remedy for isolation. But we also see, for instance, in Canada, that policy shifts turn these high rises into vertical communities and have what we could call a 40% higher resident participation if you design deliberately for participation. So we have seen examples of people actually narrowing hallways in to make sure that if two people pass each other, they're also sensing each other and they're then acknowledging each other. So they're not just passing by as strangers, but they have to, because you're limiting their space. So it gives a psychological effect that they have to acknowledge each other. We also see from Copenhagen that we have new forms of co-living models that sort of are embedding belonging directly into the housing markets, and is actually profitable as well. One interesting note when we talk about programming, because programming is basically not a new thing. It has been going on for decades to some extent, some very, very, very successful. But when it comes to loneliness, especially, we have to acknowledge that loneliness, as I said before, it changes people and it changes people's behavior. So the first step of getting somebody to step out of loneliness is just to create not just high activation where you engage with a lot of people and are extremely participatory, but it is just creating and designing for the feeling that you are allowed to stay. It's a very basic first step, but it's a very important first step, because once you've established that level of presence, and that is a very low threshold for being in a space where there is no expectation to interact, you can then physically, from a psychological point of view, move over to feel safe and create a sense of belonging to where you are. So you have these repeated presences that builds familiarity, and those that familiar face reduce social cohesion and sort of fear of rejection, and you feel at ease. You feel the Japanese concept of ibasho, and then you are ready to contribute, to engage, and going from being an observer to become a participant. So connection grows when people feel they have something to offer. Again, nobody wants to be part of the Lonely Club. They want to offer something and feel at use. We see it, for instance, in Tokyo, where they have cleanup coffee clubs, where the idea is that people just walk around in parallel and pick up trash. But the thing is really just to start by them just getting them out of the house, and then they can start interacting when they feel safe and they feel they belong. So from that thing, that is also something to keep in mind when we do these programming for loneliness, that we do need to start with very low thresholds for just being present in a space. Another thing, of course, if this is to work and if this has to have any kind of scale, is that we have to govern for belonging. Because when cities coordinate, connections become this core infrastructure. So what we've talked about a lot, especially in the project coming up as well, is how do we measure what matters here? I mean, from a urban planning perspective, we've seen a lot of yield, we've seen a lot of churn, we've seen a lot of other kinds of KPIs, profit margins, and everything that are very traditional, of course, and I don't think we necessarily lose them. But we also need to see, how do we create metrics for belonging? Is there other kind of measuring success when we are there? And that sort of takes me to some of the future thinking that we have in the book as well. And just one short example, of course, is the digital layer that we very often see being in the cities now. That we talk a lot about AI, artificial intelligence, and we see it also changes the way we design our cities. We can see that people can work from home. They can work they can go to a co-working space. They are more fragmented in their sort of way of belonging to a workplace or going to a special place. So that kind of I can work from everywhere has also dissolved some kind of belonging to a place. What is maybe interesting and maybe also a nice buffer against that dilemma or that new thing is that we can talk about not just artificial intelligence, but also ancestral intelligence, meaning that we have to look at how do we create belonging to a physical place. That is, again, redefining or at least refining how do we look at placemaking, how do we make crafts or anything that is worth highlighting, how do we see culture as a big value asset here as well. We've had an interesting conversation, for instance, with a Japanese professor where the building stock has an average age of buildings last about 30 years. What happens in a neighborhood if there is no common denominator, if the physical surroundings keep changing, are you able to connect to the same kind of place? I mean, those can be very, very interesting discussions as well. So we do need to see something stable and ancestral along with this as an answer to this also very interesting and very beneficial artificial intelligence boom that I think we're all seeing in the world. So on a very quick note, the wrong question, of course, is how do we help lonely people reconnect? It would be much more beneficial from our point of view to say, how do we create environments where connection naturally occurs? So we avoid the Lonely Club and we make sure that people feel at use when they join in. A small matter, I mean, I'm going to give you all a link to the book for free. If you want to look into it, you can see our digital version that is also on our website. But there's a lot of sort of in-depth interviews with a lot of very, very interesting people from the global north. But it also pans out into sort of 10 ways to tackle this paradox of proximity, where we made some suggestions. We're very happy to say that there is a new loneliness hub in Seoul, in the city of Seoul, that has taken these to heart and is trying to put them into use in a very, very physical place in the city. But if you're interested, please let us know if you have any questions or if you're curious for more. And again, as I said to you, please, you're more than welcome to download your own digital version It's available for free on our website and the QR code that I shared here. So thank you very much for your time. This was a very quick introduction to our publication, but I'm looking forward to hearing your feedback as well.
Thank you very much, Ann-Britt. What an amazing presentation. Thank you. You show so many ways that cities can work in order to be able to eliminate this epidemic of loneliness. How the cities through systems can produce and prevent loneliness. It's such a huge problem at all ages, almost everywhere. So please have this video and share it with decision makers, with your elected officials, with city staff, with the media, with advocates, with others. And I'll see you 2 weeks from today.